In far-off days, when knights rode into battle on dashing white chargers and fire-breathing dragons roamed the land, a child was born to a king and queen. The child, a girl, was blessed with great beauty, and her mother and father were very proud of her raven-black hair and rosy cheeks. When the child was to be christened, the king and queen prepared a huge banquet for all the nobles in the land. Invitations went out to the fairies, elves, and gnomes, for never had there been such a beautiful child. On the day of the banquet, the palace was alive with music and laughter, and each guest came to gaze upon the child as it lay in its golden crib. Gifts of every size and description were heaped around the crib, and soon the child had everything it could possibly need. The very last guest was an old woman dressed in rags. A black hood covered her head, and little of the old woman's face could be seen. As she shuffled towards the crib, a hush fell over the other guests, and they drew back. As the old woman approached the crib, she turned to the king and queen and spoke in a quivering voice. "I have been sent by the hobgoblins to look upon the child. If her beauty is truly so great, then a terrible fate will befall her. Show the child to me," demanded the old woman. The old woman climbed 3 stone steps to where the crib rested, and she looked in at the child. Throwing her hands up in horror, the old woman shrieked, "'Tis true! The child's beauty is beyond compare. She is the fairest in the whole land." The old woman turned from the crib and spoke to the silent guests. "The hobgoblins cannot allow such a child to live, for her beauty exceeds that of their own queen. The child is cursed!" screeched the old woman, and she reached into her ragged cloak and took out a small silver box. Opening the box, the old woman dipped her thumb and forefinger into it and withdrew a tiny amount of green powder, which she sprinkled over the crib. The powder flashed and crackled as it fell round the child, and the old woman let out another cackle of laughter. "Ha ha ha ha! She is cursed!" screamed the old woman. "When the child is 16, a spinning wheel will take her life." With those terrible words, the old woman leapt across the crowded but still silent room and was gone. The king, standing by the crib, felt a gentle tugging on his robe, and when he looked down he saw a fairy dressed in green and brown fluttering around his feet. "Sire," said the fairy, "I cannot break the hobgoblin's spell, but I can take some of its power away."
You can?"
asked the king, raising his eyebrows. "Yes, with my wand," said the fairy.
Then do so at once,"
commanded the king. The fairy fluttered its fragile wings and flew to the head of the crib and looked down on the now sleeping child. Taking a tiny, brightly coloured wand from its pocket, the fairy waved it across the sleeping form of the child and uttered some magical words. "There," said the fairy, fluttering down to the king's feet again. "That's done the trick. Now your beautiful daughter will not die. Instead, she will sleep for many years until a handsome prince kisses her lips." The fairy fluttered off into the dark corner of the room, and the king turned to his queen.
We must do all we can to prevent the child from touching a spinning wheel,"
he said.
"Guards,"
commanded the king,
"search every house in the land and destroy all the spinning wheels you can find."
The king's guards rode off across the land, and, after many weeks, they destroyed every spinning wheel they could lay their hands upon, until none were left. As years went by, the king and queen forgot about the terrible curse, and their daughter grew older. By the time she was 15, the girl was beautiful beyond compare, and everyone throughout the land loved her. One day, on her 16th birthday, the princess wandered into the woods that lay close to the palace, and stumbled upon a tiny house, almost hidden by ivy, rambling roses, and sweet-smelling honeysuckle. A thin trickle of wispy blue smoke lingered around the little chimney pot, and the princess knew that someone was at home. Feeling thirsty, the princess decided to knock on the door of the little house. She tiptoed up to the door and tapped gently with her knuckles. After a few moments, the door opened, and an old woman stood there, stroking a large black cat that curled round her stooping shoulders. "Yes, my dear?" asked the old woman.
"Would you be kind enough to give me a drink of water?"
asked the beautiful princess. "Do come in, my dear," replied the old woman. The princess stepped into the little house and followed the old woman down a tiny hall and into the parlour where, in a corner, stood an old spinning wheel.
"What is that?"
asked the princess. "That, my dear, is a spinning wheel, and on it I spin golden thread for the elves and fairies to make their clothes with," said the old woman.
"Why, it's simply beautiful,"
added the princess. "After you've had your drink, I will show you how I spin," said the old woman, and she scurried off to the pump to fill a goblet for the princess. Once the princess had finished her drink, the old woman sat down at the spinning wheel and began to work the treadle. The wheel spun faster and faster, and gold thread began to thread its way round the spindle. "You see, my dear, it's really very easy. Would you like to try?" asked the old woman.
"I should like to very much,"
replied the princess, and she took the old woman's place at the stool. Once again the spinning wheel began to turn, and the princess was delighted when yards of gold thread began to appear on the spindle. The princess reached across to touch the thread, but as she did so, she slipped, and her finger brushed against the sharp-pointed end of the spindle. A little droplet of blood appeared on the tip of the princess's finger, and suddenly the girl fell to the floor and lay still. "What is wrong, my dear?" cried the old woman in alarm. "'Tis only a tiny scratch." But try as she would, the old woman could not rouse the princess, and she ran out of the tiny house to seek help in the nearby village. Unfortunately, the old woman knew nothing of the king's order that all spinning wheels should be destroyed, and when the news of the princess's fate was relayed to the palace, the king flew into a terrible rage. A carriage was sent to the little woodland house, and the princess was taken back to the palace. The king's physicians tried all manner of potions to arouse the princess, but to no avail. Wizards and sorcerers were sent for, but they too were unable to waken the princess. After many weeks, the king and queen gave up all hope that their beautiful daughter would ever wake up. But he remembered the words of the good fairy that reduced the power of the curse. "She will sleep for many years until a handsome prince kisses her lips," the fairy had said. The years passed, but no prince came, and the king and queen grew older. The princess slumbered on, but with each passing day she seemed to grow even more beautiful. So many years passed, in fact, the king and queen eventually died, and the palace gradually fell into ruin, save for the room in which slept the beautiful princess. From time to time, the fairies and gentle woodland creatures would look in on the sleeping princess, but she slept on, until 100 years later, a young man stumbled upon the ruined palace. On a dark winter's night, when a cruel storm raged across the land, a weary traveller sought shelter from the wind and rain. The traveller, a young man of noble birth, was cold and wet and very tired. After journeying many miles, he came across a great building at the edge of the forest. A huge door set in the main wall of the crumbling building banged and crashed in the raging wind. The young man came to the door and pushed his way through. There, in front of him, lay a vast courtyard covered in leaves and branches. In its centre stood a great round tower, and the traveller, clutching his wet cloak closely to him, walked to the door set in the base of the tower. An iron handle hung in the middle of the door, and the traveller took it in both hands and turned it firmly. The door creaked and groaned, and then slowly opened. Once inside the tower, the weary traveller began to climb the long spiral staircase in the hope of finding a room where he could rest. Up and up he climbed, until at last he came to a small chamber at the top of the tower. The chamber contained nothing but a 4-post bed, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the centre of the 4-poster bed lay the most beautiful young girl the young man had ever seen, and brushing aside the cobwebs, he gently touched her pale cheeks with his fingertips. Somewhere high above the 4-poster bed, a soft fluttering sound attracted the young man's attention. He looked up and saw a tiny winged figure flittering backwards and forwards across the top of the 4-poster bed's silk canopy. It was a fairy, and she spoke to the young man in a tinkling, silvery voice. "For many years the princess has waited for you, sire," said the little fairy.
But what happened to her? Is she dead?
Asked the young man with great concern. The princess was cursed by the hobgoblins because of her beauty, sire, and she has lain in this chamber for 100 years, awaiting the arrival of the prince, who would kiss her lips and waken her from endless slumber, said the fairy. I have been her guardian, and you are the only one who has ever been able to open the door to the tower.
But the door wasn't locked,
said the young man. It was, replied the fairy, but the guardians of the forest told of your coming, and the lock was turned as you entered the palace courtyard. And now we have much to do, for at midnight you must kiss the princess. With a wave of her wand, the fairy suddenly produced brooms and dusters, and a pile of oak logs appeared in the hearth. When the princess wakes from her slumber, she must find the room neat and clean, said the fairy, and a fire will make her feel so happy and contented. The young man forgot all about his long journey and the need for rest, and he began to sweep out the dusty chamber. Soon the chamber sparkled like a new pin, and the fairy fluttered around the post of the bed, flicking off the remaining specks of dirt with a feather duster. A cheery log fire burned in the grate, and the entire chamber was bathed in its warm red light. The young man looked at the sleeping princess again, and his breath was taken away by her beauty. Once again he took her hand in his, and, holding it to his cheek, he fell asleep. "Wake up! Wake up!" cried a little voice. "It is 1 minute to midnight." The little fairy had fallen asleep too, but now she flustered and fussed around the four-poster bed. "Oh dear, I suppose I shall have to use a little magic to wake you with, sire," she said quickly. With that the fairy waved her wand, and the sound of church bells filled the chamber. The young man woke with a start and turned to the fairy.
Goodness me,
he cried.
Whatever is the time?
It's almost midnight, sire, and you haven't even changed your clothes. I shall have to use my third and final spell for the day if you are to be fit for a princess, scolded the fairy. Far away a church clock chimed the first stroke of midnight, and the fairy waved her wand for the third time. The young man's cloak and boots vanished in a puff of pink smoke, to be replaced by a splendid red and gold uniform. He stood up and pulled on a pair of silken gauntlets that had appeared from nowhere. "Now, sire, on the final stroke of the church clock, you must kiss the princess on the lips," said the fairy. The distant church clock continued to strike, and, on the 12th and final chime, the young man bent down and kissed the sleeping princess. In less time than it takes a heart to beat, the princess woke from her long slumber, and there by her side sat a handsome young man with fair hair and a regal face.
"But who are you? And where is the old woman with the spinning wheel?"
The young man and the tiny fairy then told the princess of the curse that had been put on her by the hobgoblins at her christening banquet, and how the spell had now been broken.
As you have 3 spells a day in your wand, good fairy, would you use the first for the new day to bring me horses, so that I may take this beautiful princess to my kingdom?
Asked the young man of the fairy.
For I am a prince, and she will be my princess.
The fairy granted the prince's wish, and he and the beautiful young princess sped across the countryside to a distant kingdom, where they were married and lived happily ever after.
Oh dear, what can the matter be? Dear, dear, what can the matter be? Oh dear, what can the matter be? John is so long at the fair. He promised he'd buy me
Once upon a time there was a little girl with golden hair and big blue eyes. Nobody knew her real name except her mummy and daddy and granny. Everybody called her Little Red Riding Hood because wherever she went she wore a red cape and hood. Red Riding Hood lived in a very pretty little cottage at the edge of a big wood. But she never went to the wood alone because of a big bad wolf who lived there. Red Riding Hood, her mother said to her one day, "What do you think? I have just heard that Granny is ill. Oh dear, what can we do to help?" Red Riding Hood was very sad when she heard her Granny was ill. "Granny lives on the other side of the wood," said she. "It's a long, long way by the road, isn't it?" "It is indeed," said Mummy, "but I cannot go myself today." "Let me go then, Mummy," cried Red Riding Hood. "Very well," said Mummy. "I shall fill the basket with eggs, jam tarts, thick honey, and a pound of fresh creamy butter. If you hurry, Red Riding Hood, you will get there before tea." "I will carry my basket very carefully," Red Riding Hood promised, "and I won't put it down anywhere." Then she kissed her mummy and ran quickly down the garden path. "Perhaps it won't matter if I take the shortcut through the woods," said she to herself as she hurried along. Red Riding Hood almost forgot about her sick granny as she skipped along and sang a song. Then Red Riding Hood remembered her granny and said, "Grandmamma is sick. I mustn't chase butterflies and I mustn't sing any more. I must hurry, hurry, hurry through the woods." But the sound of her singing had reached the ears of the big bad wolf who lived in the woods. The wolf was sly and cunning and always hungry. The wolf ran very quickly through the bushes so that when Red Riding Hood reached the big tree, he was already there.
"Good day to you,"
he said.
"What a pretty little girl you are, and what a big basket you have. Now I wonder what is in the basket, and where you can be taking it."
"The basket is for my granny," said Red Riding Hood.
"Ah,"
said the big bad wolf.
"and I suppose you are on your way to your granny."
"Yes, I am," said Red Riding Hood. "You see, my granny is sick, and she must have nice things to eat."
"And where does your granny live?"
asked the wolf, who did not dare to attack Red Riding Hood just then because there were woodcutters nearby. "Just on the other side of the wood," said Red Riding Hood, "in a dear little cottage. She lives all by herself, and she loves me very much. But I can't stop to talk."
"Of course not,"
said the wolf with a smile.
"Hurry along, my dear. I'm sure your granny is anxious to see you."
As soon as Red Riding Hood was out of sight, the wolf set off in a hurry. He knew a shortcut which would take him straight to Grandma's cottage, and he would be there long before Red Riding Hood. All grandmamas are nice. Red Riding Hood's granny was very good and sweet and kind. As soon as a little bird told Granny that Red Riding Hood was coming to see her, she began to feel better. Soon she felt strong enough to sit up in bed and do a little bit of knitting. And all the time she was listening hard for Red Riding Hood's gentle voice. "I hope she brings me a pot of honey," said Granny to herself. "A teaspoonful of honey after my nasty-tasting medicine will be far nicer than a peppermint." Grandmamma suddenly fixed her eyes on the door. She was sure there was someone outside.
"Grandmamma, Grandmamma, may I come in?"
called the big bad wolf in a voice as sweet as sugar.
"It's your own little Red Riding Hood come to see you."
"Bless you, dear child," Granny called out. "How glad I am you are here at last. Yes, yes, come in,"
"The door is shut, dear Grandmamma."
called back the wolf.
"How do I open it?"
Grandmamma said, "Just lift the bobbin, darling. I'm surprised you've forgotten." The bad wolf licked his lips with his long flat tongue as he lifted the bobbin and pushed open the door. Then he jumped onto Grandma's bed and quickly gobbled her up. He wrapped himself in her shawl and fixed her hat behind his wicked ears and balanced her glasses halfway down his nose.
"If I draw the blinds and keep well down between the sheets, little Red Riding Hood will suspect nothing,"
said the wolf. Then he hopped into bed and prepared himself to wait. Meantime, Red Riding Hood was hurrying along. At last, the cottage came in sight, and Red Riding Hood walked up the path. Very gently, she knocked on the door. "It's me, Grandmamma. It's your own little Red Riding Hood," she called out.
Come in, my dear, come in.
Called the wolf in a croaky whisper, which he hoped sounded like the voice of an old lady. "I'm coming, Grandmamma," Red Riding Hood called back, as she lifted the bobbin and pushed open the door.
Come right in, dear child.
Said the wolf in a whisper.
Come very close to the bed, my dear.
Little Red Riding Hood smiled her sweetest smile as she came towards the bed.
That's right.
Said the wolf as Red Riding Hood tiptoed up to the bed.
Come and give your granny a big hug.
But Grandmamma, said Little Red Riding Hood, what big arms you've got.
All the better to hug you with, my dear,
replied the wicked wolf. And Grandmamma, what big ears you've got.
All the better to hear you with, my dear,
said the wolf. And oh, Grandmamma, what big eyes you've got.
All the better to see you with, my child, said
the wolf. And Grandmamma, what big, big teeth you've got, cried Red Riding Hood.
Ah, so-ho!
Snarled the big bad wolf.
All the better to eat you with.
And the big bad wolf sprang clean out of bed. Help! Help! Screamed Little Red Riding Hood. Help! Help! Oh, somebody please save me! Now it chanced that day that the brave, strong hunter was out in the woods. He had his gun with him. He meant to shoot a rabbit for his supper. The hunter was a friend of Grandmamma's, and he knew that she was laid up in bed.
I'll just go to the cottage and find out how she is,
the hunter thought to himself. But as he drew near the cottage, he heard a faint cry. It sounded like a cry for help, and yes, it was coming from Grandma's cottage. He ran swiftly, and when he arrived at the cottage, he went first to the window and looked inside. There was Little Red Riding Hood, and there was a big bad wolf licking his lips with his long flat tongue. The hunter made no sound as he ran back to the cottage door and pushed it open. He raised his gun. The wolf fell dead to the floor.
The big bad wolf is dead. He can't hurt you now.
But he has eaten my granny, sobbed Red Riding Hood.
We'll soon see about that,
said the hunter, and he took his knife and cut open the wolf. And what do you think? Out stepped Grandmamma, as good as new. So all ended happily. The brave hunter stayed and poured out Granny's medicine for her, and Red Riding Hood gave her a spoonful of honey after it. Then Red Riding Hood made a pot of tea, and Granny said she felt better already. After tea, Little Red Riding Hood hugged her Granny and promised to come again very soon. Then she set off with the hunter to walk back home through the woods, and there was no big bad wolf to watch them go.
London's burning, fetch
London's
the
burning,
engines,
London's burning,
fetch
fetch the engines, fetch the engines,
pour on water, pour on water. London's burning, fetch the engines, fetch the engines.
Once upon a time there was a very poor miller. He was so poor that when he died all he had to leave to his 3 sons were his mill, his donkey, and his cat. The eldest son got the mill, the middle son got the donkey, and the youngest son got the cat. "A cat is no good to me," said the youngest son. "It can never help me to get rich."
Why don't you wait and see?
Said the cat.
I may surprise you if you will only trust me. I promise you that if you give me what I ask, I will help you make a fortune.
The young man laughed at the cat, but as he had nothing to lose, he agreed to do as the cat wanted.
All I need,
Said the cat.
is a pair of tall boots and a big sack.
So with his last few coins, the young man bought a pair of boots and a bag. The next day the cat put on his boots, and from that time onwards he was known as Puss in Boots. Then Puss slung the bag over his shoulder and went off into the garden and collected some fresh lettuce leaves, which he put into his bag. Next, Puss walked across the field until he found a rabbit hole. Leaving the mouth of the bag open, he lay quietly down nearby. A very plump rabbit soon peeped out of the hole, smelled the fresh lettuce, and dived into the bag to find it. Puss quickly pulled the strings of the bag, and the rabbit was caught. Puss then marched off in his new shiny boots towards the king's palace, and when he got there, he asked to speak to the king. When he was brought before the king, Puss said to him,
Please accept this rabbit as a gift from my master, the Marquis of Carabas.
The king was amused by the cat wearing boots, and he said, Tell your master I accept his gift, and I am much obliged. In the days that followed, Puss bought more and more gifts for the king, pheasants, pigeons, and more rabbits. As before, the king accepted the gifts, which, according to Puss, came from the Marquis of Carabas. Soon the king began to wish that he could meet the generous Marquis of Carabas, and Puss decided it was time to put the next part of his plan into action.
Do just as I say,
Said Puss to his poor young master.
and bathe in the river tomorrow.
You see, Puss knew that the king had a beautiful daughter, and the king had made plans to take his daughter for a ride along the river the following morning. Very well, said the poor miller's son, but I wish I knew what this was all about. He was still wondering the next morning when he went with Puss to the river.
There are 2 things I want you to do.
Said Puss.
First, you must bathe here in the river, and secondly, you must believe that you are the Marquis of Carabas.
I've never heard of the Marquis of Carabas, said the miller's son, but I will do as you say. Soon the royal carriage came into sight. The king was sitting in his carriage with his beautiful daughter beside him. Suddenly, they were startled by a cry.
Help! Help! My master, the Marquis of Carabas, is drowning!
The king looked out of his carriage and saw Puss running up and down beside the river. Then he ordered his men to run and get the drowning man out of the river.
Your Majesty,
Said Puss.
what shall my poor master do? A thief has stolen all his clothes.
The truth is, of course, Puss had really hidden his master's old clothes under a large stone. The king immediately gave orders to one of his men to fetch a new suit of clothes from the palace. When the miller's son was dressed in his new suit, he looked a very fine man indeed. The king then invited him to go for a drive with him, and the young miller accepted and sat in the carriage next to the beautiful princess. Puss ran on quickly ahead of the carriage. He stopped in the next meadow where the mowers were cutting the grass.
The king is coming,
Said Puss.
and unless you say that this meadow belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, you may get your heads chopped off.
The mowers were simple men, and they were scared to hear a cat talking in such a fierce voice. Soon the king came along and stopped when he saw the lovely meadows, and he spoke to the mowers. Tell me, he said, who owns this meadow? It belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, your majesty, replied the mowers. The king turned to the miller's son. You certainly do own a fine meadow, he said. Meanwhile, Puss had run on further down the road until he reached a cornfield in which the reapers were busy cutting the corn.
The king is coming,
Said Puss.
and unless you say that this cornfield belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, you will probably get your heads chopped off. Meow.
The reapers were also simple men, and were scared to hear a cat talking in such a fierce voice. Soon the king came along and said, Who owns this fine cornfield? The Marquis of Carabas, replied the reapers. What a rich man he must be, and how handsome he looks, said the king. I do believe he'd make a fine husband for my daughter. Now the fields were really owned by an ogre, and this ogre lived in a big castle further on down the road. Puss walked to the castle and knocked on the door. The ogre opened the door.
Sir,
Said the puss.
I am on a journey, and as I've heard what a wonderful person you are, I decided to try and meet you.
The ogre invited Puss into the castle.
I have heard
Said Puss.
that you are very clever and can change yourself into any animal you choose.
That is true.
Said the ogre, and instantly changed himself into a lion. For a moment, Puss was scared and leapt onto a table out of harm's way. The ogre changed himself back to an ogre again and thought himself very clever.
That frightened me.
Said Puss.
Can you change yourself into something a little bit smaller? Meow.
Of course I can.
Boasted the ogre, and immediately changed himself into a little grey mouse. Cats like eating mice, and Puss was no exception. He quickly pounced on the grey mouse and gobbled it up, and that, of course, was the end of the ogre. By this time the king, still riding in his carriage with his daughter and the young miller, arrived at the castle. Puss ran out of the castle to meet the king's carriage.
Welcome, your majesty.
Said Puss.
Welcome to the castle of the Marquis of Carabas.
The king turned to the young miller and said, "So this is where you live. What a beautiful castle. It's better than my own palace." The king and his daughter went into the castle with the young miller and Puss, and they all had a wonderful feast. After they had all eaten, the king said, "There is no one in the world I would rather have to marry my daughter. I now make you a prince." The young miller said he loved the princess, and she said that she loved him too. And so they married and lived happily ever after in the ogre's castle. And what happened to Puss? Well, she became the prince and princess's favourite pet and lived in luxury for the rest of her life.
It's so